Nothing breaks a man's heart like watching the woman he loves slip away from him. For cowboy Levi Thornton, that heartbreak began the morning he noticed a small dark spot on his new wife's cheek. Mara was a city girl who had come to Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, looking for a simpler life. She found love instead with a quiet rancher 20 years older. 3 weeks after their wedding, the spot appeared. The local doctor said it was nothing serious, probably just her skin adjusting to country living. But then, it started to move. The dark mark would shift across her face while she slept. Mara began hearing whispers at night, voices speaking words she couldn't understand. When Levi searched through his late mother's belongings, he found an old photograph tucked inside her Bible. The woman in the picture looked exactly like Mara, down to the same mysterious mark on her face. The photograph was dated 1912. Could it be that Mara's arrival wasn't just chance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, was the kind of place where time moved at the pace of cattle and seasons. Nestled between rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and the shadow of the Wind River Mountains, the town had seen better days. What had once been a thriving ranching community now barely sustained 300 souls, most of them stubborn enough to stay despite the economic hardships that had driven their neighbors to bigger cities. The main street stretched for exactly 4 blocks, lined with weathered storefronts that had witnessed 4 generations of the same families. Crenshaw's General Store occupied the corner building, its wooden sign faded but still readable after 60 years. Next door, Doc Henley's clinic operated out of what had been the old telegraph office, complete with the original tin ceiling and creaky wooden floors. The Copper Kettle Cafe served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and breakfast that hadn't changed since 1952. At the far end of town, St. Mary's Catholic Church stood sentinel over the community, its white steeple visible from miles away. Across the prairie, Mara Elizabeth Thornton had arrived in this pocket of unchanging America 6 months ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Born Mara Catherine Wells in Philadelphia, she had spent 36 years in the bustling chaos of city life, working as a certified public accountant for a firm that specialized in corporate tax law. Her days had been filled with spreadsheets, deadlines, and the constant hum of traffic outside her 20th floor office window. That life had ended abruptly on a rainy Tuesday in March, when a drunk driver ran a red light and collided with her parents' sedan. Thomas and Margaret Wells died instantly, leaving their only daughter to navigate the crushing weight of grief and the realization that she had built a life around work instead of relationships. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by her parents' elderly neighbors and a handful of colleagues who barely knew her outside of quarterly reports. Standing in her childhood bedroom after the service, surrounded by the accumulated memories of people who had loved her unconditionally, Mara had felt something break inside her chest, not just her heart, that had shattered the moment she received a phone call, but something deeper. Her sense of purpose, perhaps, or her understanding of what mattered in the brief span of a human life. 3 weeks later, she had sold her condo, resigned from the firm, and loaded her Honda Civic with everything that couldn't be replaced. She had no destination in mind, only a desperate need to find something real in a world that suddenly felt hollow and temporary. The drive west had been therapeutic, each mile putting distance between her and the life that no longer fit. She had stopped in Cedar Ridge purely by chance, needing gas and a decent cup of coffee. The Copper Kettle's apple pie had convinced her to stay the night at the town's only motel. The next morning, she had attended the weekly cattle auction, drawn by curiosity and the authentic slice of American life she had only seen in movies. That was where she met Levi Thornton at 46. Levi carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to find peace in solitude. He stood 6 feet tall in his worn boots, with calloused hands that spoke of decades spent working the land and gentle brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's heart. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and when he smiled, which he did when he caught Mara staring at him across the auction ring, the lines around his eyes deepened in a way that suggested laughter came naturally to him. He had been bidding on a small herd of black Angus cattle when their eyes met. Later, Mara would swear she felt something shift in the universe at that moment, as if all the scattered pieces of her life suddenly clicked into place. Levi had approached her during the lunch break, his hat in his hands and a shy smile on his face. "You're not from around here," he had said, and it wasn't a question. "Philadelphia," she had replied. "Just passing through." "Well," he had said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had never felt the need to rush his words, "I hope you'll consider passing through slowly." 3 days later, she was still in town. A week after that, she had rented a small apartment above the hardware store. By the end of the month, Levi was driving the 40 minutes from his ranch to town every evening just to have dinner with her at the Copper Kettle. Their courtship had been deliberate and gentle, like everything else in Levi's world. He had lost his first wife, Sarah, to breast cancer 3 years earlier, and the grief had settled into his bones like winter cold. He hadn't expected to feel his heart open again, hadn't believed it was possible. But Mara brought light back into spaces that had been dark for too long. She learned that he had inherited the Thornton ranch from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 4 generations of Thornton men had worked the same land, raised cattle in the same pastures, and endured the boom and bust cycles that define rural life in Wyoming. The ranch wasn't large by local standards, 1,500 acres of grazing land and a modest herd of cattle, but it was profitable enough to sustain a simple life. Levi's reputation in town was unassailable. He paid his debts on time, helped his neighbors during calving season, and never spoke ill of anyone. When Sarah had been sick, he had driven her to chemotherapy appointments in Cheyenne twice a week for 8 months, never missing a session. After she died, he had donated her entire wardrobe to the church charity drive and established a small scholarship fund for local students pursuing nursing degrees. The Thornton Ranch House sat 2 miles outside of town, accessible by a gravel road that wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. Built in the 1920s by Levi's grandfather, it was a modest 2-story structure with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun. The kitchen still had the original farmhouse sink and a vintage gas range that Sarah had lovingly maintained. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms overlooked the pastures where cattle grazed beneath the endless Wyoming sky. Mara had fallen in love with the ranch almost as quickly as she had fallen in love with Levi. After years of apartment living, the space and silence felt like a gift. She learned to collect eggs from the henhouse, to recognize the different calls of meadowlarks and red-winged blackbirds, and to find peace in the rhythm of ranch life that shifted with the seasons. Their wedding had been small and perfect, held in the living room of the ranch house with Father Miguel officiating and Jake Morrison serving as best man. Jake had been Levi's closest friend since childhood, a fellow rancher whose family had worked the land adjacent to the Thorntons for 3 generations. Martha Crenshaw had provided the flowers from her garden, and Doc Henley had played guitar. For the ceremony, his weathered fingers surprisingly nimble on the strings, Mara wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Levita had picked that morning. When they exchanged vows, her voice had trembled not with nervousness but with the overwhelming sense that she had finally found her way home. The townspeople had welcomed her with the reserved warmth typical of rural communities. They were polite, but cautious, as outsiders were always viewed with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Martha Crenshaw, who had run the general store for 30 years and served as the unofficial keeper of town gossip, made an effort to include Mara in the Wyoming weekly quilting circle. Doc Henley, a man in his 70s who had delivered half the babies in town, examined her thoroughly when she registered as a new patient and pronounced her healthy as a horse. But there had been moments, fleeting glances, conversations that stopped when she entered a room, whispered discussions that seemed to center around her, that made Mara feel like she was missing some crucial piece of information. When she mentioned these observations to Levi, he had dismissed them as typical small-town curiosity about newcomers. "Give them time," he had said, pulling her close as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "They'll come around. They just need to get used to having someone new in the family." The adjustment to ranch life had its challenges. Mara had never cooked for someone who worked physical labor all day, and her first attempts at hearty ranch meals had been disasters of epic proportions. She had burned cornbread, oversalted beef stew, and somehow managed to make coffee that Levi diplomatically described as strong enough to float a horseshoe. But she was determined to learn, and gradually, with patient instruction from Levi and tips from Martha Crenshaw, she began to master the art of country cooking. She learned to read the weather and the behavior of the cattle, to spot signs of illness in the chickens, and to appreciate the complex ecology of grassland that sustained their modest operation. On clear nights, she and Levi would sit on the porch with mugs of coffee, watching the stars emerge in the sky unmarred by city lights. Those moments felt sacred to her, profound in their simplicity. The first 3 weeks of their marriage had been blissful. They settled into routines that felt natural and comfortable, as if they had been partners for years rather than months. Mara handled the bookkeeping and correspondence, while Levi managed the livestock and maintained the property. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together, shared stories of their days, and planned modest improvements to the house and ranch. Levi proved to be a generous and attentive husband, patient with her questions about ranch life and thoughtful about including her in decisions. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, and a way of looking at her that made her feel beautiful and valued. The 20-year age difference that had concerned some of their friends in Philadelphia felt irrelevant in the context of their life together. But change, as Mara had learned too well, could arrive without warning and transform everything in an instant. On a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 3 weeks after their wedding, she woke to find a small, dark spot on her left cheek that hadn't been there the night before. Mara first noticed the spot while brushing her teeth in the master bathroom, catching her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The mark was roughly the size of a dime, perfectly circular, and so dark it looked like someone had touched her face with charcoal. She leaned closer to the mirror, turning her head to examine it from different angles. "Probably just a bruise," she murmured to herself, though she couldn't remember bumping her face on anything. Maybe she had scratched herself in her sleep. Or perhaps it was some kind of reaction to the new laundry detergent Martha had recommended. When Levi came in from the morning chores, she pointed it out to him over breakfast. "What do you think this is?" she asked, tilting her face toward the light streaming through the kitchen window. Levi set down his coffee cup and studied her cheek with the same careful attention he paid to examining cattle for signs of illness. His calloused fingers gently traced the air around the mark, not quite touching her skin. "Looks like maybe you rubbed against something rough," he said finally. "Could be you bumped into the fence post yesterday when we were checking on the heifers. You remember catching yourself when you stumbled?" Mara touched the spot gingerly. It didn't hurt, didn't feel raised or tender like a typical bruise. If anything, the skin felt cooler than the surrounding area, as if the mark was somehow drawing heat away from her face. "Maybe," she agreed, though she didn't remember stumbling. "I'll keep an eye on it." But over the next 48 hours, instead of fading like a normal bruise, the spot grew darker and more defined. By Thursday morning, it had expanded to the size of a quarter, and Mara noticed that its edges seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it. When she mentioned this to Levi, he suggested they have Doc Henley take a look. "Better safe than sorry," he said, though she caught a flicker of concern in his eyes that he tried to hide behind his morning coffee. Doc Henley's clinic occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Main Street, sandwiched between the post office and Paulson's feed store. The waiting room held 6 mismatched chairs, a scarred wooden table covered with outdated magazines, and a reception desk that had been repurposed from what looked like an old church pew. The walls were decorated with faded photographs of the town's early days and a collection of certificates documenting Dr. Henry Henley's medical education and 40-year service to the community. The doctor himself was a slight man in his 70s, with sparse white hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that trembled almost imperceptibly from what Mara assumed was the natural progression of age. He had delivered most of the people under 40 in Cedar Ridge and had guided their parents and grandparents through births, illnesses, and deaths with the kind of steady competence that rural communities depended on. When Mara explained about the spot, Doc Henley's expression shifted from professional interest to something she couldn't quite identify. He examined her face with a magnifying glass, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and pipe tobacco. His hands, despite their tremor, were gentle as he palpated the area around the mark. "How long did you say this has been present?" he asked, stepping back to clean his glasses. 4 days now," Mara replied. "It started small, but it's getting bigger." Doc Henley nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He asked about her medical history, her recent activities, whether she had been exposed to any chemicals or unusual substances. His questions seemed routine, but there was something in his manner, a carefully controlled urgency, that suggested the spot was more significant than he was letting on. "Wow," he said finally, settling behind his desk and reaching for a prescription pad. "It's probably just a reaction to something in the environment. Your skin adjusting to our high altitude and dry climate. I'll give you some antibiotics just to be safe, and we'll keep an eye on it." The antibiotics came in a plain brown bottle with instructions to take 1 pill twice daily with food. Doc Henley handed them to her with the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring, but somehow had the opposite effect. "Come back in a week," he said, "sooner if it gets worse or if you notice any other symptoms." That night, Mara took her first antibiotic with dinner and went to bed feeling cautiously optimistic. Doc Henley was probably right. Her body was still adjusting to the dramatic change in climate and lifestyle. In a few days, the spot would fade and become nothing more than a minor concern to laugh about later. She was wrong. Mara woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of whispers. Not the kind of whispers that might drift through walls from a neighboring room, but voices that seemed to originate inside her own head. The words were indistinct, spoken in what sounded like a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. On a level deeper than conscious thought, the voices carried an urgent, pleading quality that made her heart race with inexplicable dread. She sat up in bed, instantly alert, and listened carefully. Beside her, Levi slept peacefully, his breathing deep and regular. The house was silent, except for the usual settling sounds and the distant lowing of cattle in the far pasture. But the whispers continued, growing more insistent, as if the speakers were trying desperately to communicate something important. "Levi," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Do you hear that?" He stirred and opened his eyes, immediately alert, in the way of someone accustomed to being awakened by emergencies. "Hear what?" he asked, propping himself up on one elbow. The voices, someone's whispering. Levi listened intently for nearly a full minute, his expression growing more concerned as the silence stretched between them. "I don't hear anything, honey," he said finally. "Maybe you were dreaming?" But Mara was wide awake, and the whispers continued for another 20 minutes before gradually fading away. She didn't sleep again that night, lying beside Levi and staring at the ceiling while trying to convince herself that stress and the change in environment were playing tricks with her mind. The next morning brought a discovery that shattered any hope of a rational explanation. When Mara looked in the bathroom mirror, the dark spot had moved. Where it had been positioned on her left cheek the night before, there was now only clear, unmarked skin. The spot had migrated to a position just below her left eye, as if it had crawled across her face. While she slept, she called for Levi, with a voice pitched higher than she intended. He appeared in the bathroom doorway, still buttoning his shirt, took one look at her face, and went very still. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They stood together in front of the mirror, studying the mark that defied every logical explanation they could construct. The spot was exactly the same size and color as it had been the night before, but it had definitely changed position. There was no denying what they could both see clearly. "We need to go back to Doc Henley," Levi said, his usual calm certainty replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. But when they returned to the clinic that afternoon, Doc Henley's examination revealed nothing new. He studied the spots. New location with the same magnifying glass, made notes in Mara's file, and prescribed a stronger antibiotic along with a mild sedative to help her sleep. Sometimes these kinds of skin conditions can seem to change appearance due to lighting, swelling, or other factors, he explained, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers directly. "The important thing is not to panic. Keep taking the medication, get plenty of rest, and try not to worry about it." That night, despite the sedative, Mara woke again to whispers. This time, the voices seemed closer, more distinct. She caught fragments of words and what sounded like Spanish mixed with something else, a language that felt ancient and somehow familiar. The speakers seemed to be warning her about something, their tone urgent and frightened. When morning came, the spot had moved again, this time to her jawline. And for the first time since it appeared, Mara noticed other symptoms. She felt tired despite having slept. Her appetite had diminished, and there was a persistent chill in her bones that no amount of warm clothing could dispel. Over breakfast, she watched Levi struggle to maintain his composure as he studied her face. The strong, steady man she had married was beginning to crack under the weight of something that challenged everything he understood about the world. "Maybe we should drive to Cheyenne," he suggested, his voice carefully controlled. "See a specialist. Get a second opinion." But even as he spoke, both of them knew they were dealing with something that no doctor in Cheyenne or anywhere else would be able to explain. The spot on Mara's face was not following the rules of medicine or science. It was something else entirely, something that belonged to a different category of experience altogether. That evening, desperate for answers, Levi began searching through his mother's belongings, which had been stored in the attic since her death 5 years earlier. He worked methodically through boxes of papers, photographs, and keepsakes, looking for anything that might provide insight into what was happening to his wife Dot. It was nearly midnight when he found the photograph tucked between the pages of his mother's Bible. The picture was sepia-toned and professionally taken, the kind of formal portrait that was common in the early 20th century. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, with dark hair arranged in the style of the era and eyes that seemed to look directly into the camera with a mixture of hope and sorrow. But it was the mark on her face that made Levi's hand shake as he held the photograph up to the lamplight. On the woman's left cheek was a dark spot identical in size, shape, and position to the mark that had first appeared on Mara's face. Written in faded ink on the back of the photograph were the words, "Elena Vasquez, 1912, God rest her soul." Levi didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the photograph spread before him next to a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, studying every detail of the woman's face by lamplight. Elena Vasquez looked to be about Mara's age, with the same delicate bone structure and large, expressive eyes. But it was the mark on her face that held his attention, a dark spot positioned exactly where Mara's had first appeared. When Mara came downstairs at dawn, still groggy from the sedative, she found him there. The photograph lay between them like an accusation. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my mother's Bible," Levi replied. Hidden between the pages of Psalms, Mara picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, turning it over to read the inscription. Elena Vasquez, 1912. The date was more than a century old. "She looks like me," Mara said, though it was more than resemblance. The similarity was so striking, it was almost as if she were looking at a photograph of herself in period costume. "More than looks like you," Levi said grimly. "She has the same mark." That morning, they drove to town with a sense of purpose neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Levi parked outside Doc Henley's clinic, and they sat in the truck for several minutes, gathering courage for a conversation that might change everything they thought they knew about their quiet Wyoming town. Doc Henley was organizing patient files when they entered, his movements more hurried than usual. When he saw the photograph Levi placed on his desk, his face went pale beneath his white whiskers. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice strained. "In my mother's belongings," Levi said. "I think it's time you told us what you know about Elena Vasquez." Doc Henley removed his glasses and cleaned them with shaking hands, a gesture that seemed to buy him time to consider his response. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one carried significant weight. "I've been the doctor in this town for 40 years, he said. "But Elena's case happened before my time. My predecessor, Dr. James Whitmore, kept detailed records of unusual cases. I found his files when I took over the practice." He led them to the basement of the clinic, a cramped space that smelled of dust and old paper. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, containing decades of medical records. Doc Henley pulled a thick folder from one of the older cabinets and spread its contents across a wooden table that looked like it had been salvaged from a school. The file contained Elena Vasquez's complete medical history, documented in the careful handwriting of a doctor who had clearly been both fascinated and disturbed by her case. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1912. "Patient presents with unusual dermatological condition." Levi read aloud from Dr. Whitmore's notes. "Dark circular lesion on left cheek, approximately 1 inch in diameter. Patient reports lesion appeared overnight with no apparent cause. No signs of infection or trauma." The subsequent entries traced a progression that was hauntingly familiar. The mark had grown larger, changed position, and resisted all conventional treatment. Elena had complained of hearing voices, experiencing fatigue, and suffering from a persistent chill that no amount of warm clothing could alleviate. "Listen to this," Mara said, pointing to an entry dated April 2nd, 1912. "Patient reports lesion has migrated to position below left eye." When questioned about this impossible claim, patient became agitated and insisted that it moves when I'm not watching. Physical examination confirms lesion is indeed in different location than previously documented. Dr. Whitmore's notes became increasingly concerned as Elena's condition progressed. He had consulted with colleagues in Denver and Chicago, sent detailed descriptions, and even attempted photographs, but no one could offer an explanation for what they were observing. "What happened to her?" Levi asked, though something in Doc Henley's expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "She disappeared," Doc Henley said quietly. "On May 18th, 1912, her husband found her nightgown by the creek that runs through Devil's Canyon, but they never found her body. The official report listed her as presumed drowned, but there were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, and the water was too shallow for an adult to drown accidentally. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. She was married to a local rancher? Doc Henley nodded. Roberto Vasquez. He was 20 years older than Elena, a widower who had advertised for a wife in newspapers back east. Elena came from New York, looking for a fresh start after losing her family in a tenement fire. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Elena had been an outsider who married an older local man. She had developed the same mysterious mark, heard the same unexplained voices, and suffered the same physical symptoms. And she had vanished without a trace. "There's more," Doc Henley said, pulling additional files from the cabinet. Elena wasn't the first. The files contained records dating back to the 1880s, documenting similar cases that occurred roughly every 30 to 40 years. Each case followed the same pattern. An outsider woman would arrive in town, marry a local man, develop the mysterious mark, and then disappear. The details varied slightly. Sometimes the women were mail-order brides. Sometimes they were teachers or nurses who had come west seeking employment. But the core elements remained constant. "How many?" Mara asked, her voice barely audible. 7 documented cases since the town was founded, Doc Henley replied. Probably more that weren't recorded. This kind of thing wasn't always written down, especially in the early days. Levi studied the timeline, his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. "Every generation," he said. "It happens every generation." They spent the rest of the morning reading through the files, searching for any clue that might explain what was happening to Mara. The medical descriptions were remarkably consistent across decades, but none of the doctors had been able to identify a cause or develop an effective treatment. As they prepared to leave, Doc Henley pulled Mara aside and handed her a small manila envelope. "These belong to Elena," he said. "Dr. Whitmore kept them, hoping they might provide insight. They've been locked in my safe for 30 years. Inside the envelope were 3 pages torn from what appeared to be a diary, written in elegant script that was still legible despite its age. The entries were dated in April 1912, just weeks before Elena's disappearance. April 10th, Mara read aloud as they sat in the truck outside the clinic. The whispers are getting stronger. I can almost understand what they're trying to tell me, but the words slip away like water through my fingers. Roberto thinks I'm going mad, and perhaps I am. But the thing on my face knows something I don't. I can feel it listening when the voices speak." The second entry was more disturbing. April 18th. I found myself standing in the canyon this morning with no memory of how I got there. My feet were bare and cut from the rocks, but I felt no pain. The thing spoke to me in Roberto's voice, but when I turned around, he wasn't there. It's learning to use the voices of people I trust. The final entry was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and urgent. April 25th. It's not a mark, it's a window. Something is looking through me, trying to remember what it was like to be alive. I can feel it stirring, getting stronger. Roberto found me digging in the garden last night, but I was looking for something I've never lost. The thing that remembers is calling others like itself. God help me, I think I know what it wants. Mara's hand shook as she folded the pages and returned them to the envelope. Elena's words resonated with a truth that was both terrifying and somehow familiar, as if the experiences she described were memories rather than revelations. "We need to talk to Father Miguel," Levi said, starting the truck's engine. "If anyone in this town knows what's really going on, it'll be him." Father Miguel Santos had served St. Mary's Catholic Church for 40 years, arriving in Cedar Ridge as a young priest fresh from the seminary in Colorado. Now approaching 70, he moved with the careful dignity of someone whose joints protested against Wyoming winters, but whose spirit remained unbroken. His office in the church rectory was lined with theological texts in 3 languages and photographs documenting 4 decades of baptisms. confirmations, and funerals. When Levi and Mara arrived that afternoon, they found him tending to the small garden behind the church, pulling weeds from between rows of tomatoes and peppers that he coaxed from the reluctant soil each summer. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, but he stopped immediately when he saw Mara's face. "Deus mio," he whispered, crossing himself with earth-stained fingers. "You recognize it," Levi said. It wasn't a question. Father Miguel nodded. Slowly, his dark eyes studying Mara with a mixture of compassion and deep concern. "Come inside," he said. "We need to talk." The priest's office was cool and quiet, with afternoon sunlight filtering through stained glass windows that cast colored patterns across worn carpeting. Father Miguel poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been purchased sometime in the 1980s and settled into the chair behind his desk with a heaviness that suggested the weight of unwelcome knowledge. "How much do you know about the history of this land?" he asked. "Just what everyone knows," Levi replied. "Cattle ranching, homesteaders, the usual Western story." Father Miguel opened his desk drawer and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to my predecessor, Father Joseph Martinelli. He served this parish from 1905 until his death in 1943. His notes describe incidents that the church has worked very hard to keep quiet." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read. "June 15th, 1912. Elena Vasquez came to me again today, begging for help with what she calls the thing that watches through the mark. I have tried every blessing, every prayer, every ritual the church teaches for cases of spiritual affliction, but nothing has diminished her suffering. I fear we are dealing with something older than our faith, something that was here long before the first Spanish missionaries arrived." Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He knew about Elena. Father Martinelli documented 7 similar cases during his time here, Father Miguel said. Each woman who developed the mark sought help from the church. Each one disappeared despite our efforts to protect them. He turned to another marked page. The pattern always begins the same way. An outsider woman arrives in town, usually young, and recently bereaved or displaced. She marries a local man, always someone from one of the founding families. Within weeks, the mark appears, and the possession begins. Possession? Levi's voice was sharp. Father Miguel nodded grimly. That's what Father Martinelli believed, though he admitted it didn't follow traditional patterns. The entity doesn't seem to want to harm the host initially. Instead, it appears to be learning from them, experiencing life through their senses and memories. Mara's hands trembled as she reached into her purse and withdrew the diary pages Doc Henley had given them. Elena wrote that the thing was trying to remember what it was like to be alive. Father Miguel read Elena's words with the careful attention of someone accustomed to weighing spiritual evidence. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "There's something else you need to know," he said. "This church wasn't built here by accident. According to diocesan records, the site was chosen specifically because the previous church structure had been destroyed by what the reports called supernatural disturbances." He led them to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office and withdrew. A folder containing architectural drawings and correspondence dating back to the 1890s. The papers documented the construction of the current church building and referenced an earlier structure that had been rendered uninhabitable by forces beyond human understanding. The original church was built in 1881, shortly after the town was founded, Father Miguel explained. It lasted exactly 7 years before the incidents began. Strange sounds, unexplained phenomena, and several deaths that couldn't be explained by conventional means. Among the papers was a surveyor's map that showed the church's position relative to the surrounding land. Mara studied it carefully, noting how the property boundaries related to the current ranch holdings. "Wait," she said. pointing to a section of the map. "This area here, isn't that part of the Thornton Ranch?" Levi leaned over her shoulder to look at the map, his finger tracing the property lines. "That's the south pasture," he said. "Where?" "We found those old stone foundations when I was a kid. My father always said they were from some settler's cabin that got abandoned." "Not a cabin," Father Miguel said quietly. "Those are the remains of the original church. And according to these records, it was built directly over what the Territorial Survey identified as a Native American burial ground." The revelation hit Mara like a physical blow. She had walked over that ground dozens of times, admiring the wildflowers that grew more abundantly there than anywhere else on the ranch. She remembered commenting to Levi about how peaceful the area felt, how it seemed to hold an almost sacred quality that she couldn't quite explain. "The Native Americans who lived here, do you know what tribe?" she asked. Father Miguel nodded. "Apache, primarily, though this was also sacred ground for several other tribes. The burial sites date back centuries, possibly longer. When the first settlers arrived in the 1870s, they were warned by the few remaining Native Americans to avoid that area, but the warnings were ignored." He returned to Father Montanelli's journal and found another marked passage. "Listen to this, written in 1913, just after Elena's disappearance. I have spoken with Thomas Crowfeather, one of the last Apache elders who remembers the old stories. He tells me that the burial ground contains the remains of a powerful medicine man who was buried alive by his own people for practicing forbidden magic. The spirit was bound to the earth to prevent it from moving on to the next world, but the binding requires specific rituals to maintain its power. The desecration of the burial ground has weakened those bonds." Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of forbidden magic? According to Thomas Crowfeather's account, the medicine man had learned to possess the living, jumping from body to body to extend his natural life. When his own people discovered what he was doing, they performed a binding ritual and buried him alive in a special chamber designed to trap his spirit. Father Miguel closed the journal and looked directly at Mara. "The entity that's affecting you isn't random. It's intelligent, patient, and it's been learning for over a century how to break free from its prison." That evening, as Mara prepared for bed, she noticed something that made her call out for Levi. Among her jewelry, laid out on the dresser where she always placed it at night, was a pendant she had never seen before. It was carved from black stone obsidian, perhaps, and bore symbols that looked like a combination of ancient Native American petroglyphs and something else she couldn't identify. "Where did this come from?" she asked when Levi appeared in the doorway. He examined the pendant carefully, his expression troubled. "I've never seen it before." "Are you sure it wasn't in your jewelry box already?" Mara shook her head. "I would have remembered something like this. The stone is beautiful, but the symbols ... She trailed off, studying the intricate carvings. Despite having no knowledge of Native American iconography, the symbols seemed familiar, as if she had seen them before in dreams or half-remembered visions. "Maybe it belonged to the previous owner of the house," Levi suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "My mother might have left it somewhere, and we just never noticed." But even as he spoke, both of them knew that wasn't true. The pendant hadn't been there before, and its sudden appearance felt significant in a way that made Mara's skin crawl. She placed it back on the dresser, but throughout the night, she found herself drawn to look at it, as if the carved symbols were trying to communicate something just beyond her understanding. The whispers returned that night, stronger and more coherent than before. Mara found herself understanding fragments of what sounded like Spanish, mixed with words in a language she had never heard but somehow recognized. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple speakers, all trying to warn her about something approaching. "No perteneces, Acqui," one voice whispered urgently. "You don't belong here." "El Guardian despierta," said another. The Guardian Awakens. When she woke the next morning, the obsidian pendant was around her neck, though she had no memory of putting it on. The mark on her face had moved again, this time positioning itself directly below her right eye, and for the first time, she noticed thin black lines spreading outward from it like tiny veins beneath her skin. Levi found her standing in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing the new markings with her fingertip. "It's spreading," she said, her voice unnaturally calm, considering the circumstances. Levi studied her reflection with growing alarm. The black lines were faint but clearly visible, creating a delicate web pattern that extended from the main mark toward her temple and jawline. "We need to call Jake," he said. His grandmother was Apache. If anyone knows about the old stories, it'll be his family. Jake Morrison arrived within an hour, bringing with him his grandmother's journal and a collection of items that she had saved from the early days of their family's time in Wyoming. Mary Crowfeather Morrison had been Thomas Crowfeather's granddaughter, and she had spent her life documenting the oral histories of her people before they were completely lost. When Jake saw the pendant around Mara's neck, his face went pale. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his usual easy demeanor replaced by something approaching fear. "It just appeared," Mara said. "I found it on my dresser last night." Jake reached into the collection of items he had brought and withdrew an old photograph. It showed a group of Native American men and women in traditional dress, standing in front of what looked like a ceremonial structure. One of the men wore an identical pendant around his neck. "That's Joseph Standing Bear," Jake said, pointing to the man in the photograph. "According to my grandmother's notes, he was the medicine man who was buried alive. The pendant was buried with him, along with other ceremonial objects that were supposed to keep his spirit bound to the burial chamber." The implications hit them all simultaneously. If the pendant was here, in Mara's possession, it meant that the binding that had held the medicine man's spirit for over a century was beginning to fail. Over the next week, Mara's transformation accelerated with terrifying speed. The dark mark that had begun as a small spot now covered nearly half her face, and the black veins had spread to create an intricate web pattern that extended from her temple to her collarbone. Her reflection in mirrors had become something alien and frightening, as if the person looking back at her was someone or something else entirely. The townspeople's behavior changed dramatically. Where once they had offered polite smiles and cautious conversation, now they crossed streets to avoid her and Levi, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and what looked almost like guilt. Martha Crenshaw, who had been making an effort to include Mara in community activities, now hurried past them without acknowledgement when they encountered her at the general store. It was during one of these uncomfortable encounters that Martha's elderly mother, Agnes, approached Mara with the unsteady determination of someone who had made a difficult decision. "I need to tell you something," Agnes whispered, her watery blue eyes darting nervously around the store. "About Elena Vasquez." They met that evening at Angie's small house on the outskirts of town, a weathered structure that had been built in the 1920s and looked like it hadn't been updated since. Agnes served tea in china cups that rattled against their saucers due to her trembling hands, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard. "I was 8 years old when Elena came to town," Agnes began. "My great-grandmother, Sarah Crenshaw, was one of the few people who tried to help her. The rest of the town." She trailed off, shaking her head sadly. "What did your great-grandmother tell you?" Mara asked gently. Agnes reached into a wooden chest beside her chair and withdrew a faded photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, standing beside what appeared to be Elena Vasquez. Both women looked thin and tired, as if they had been through an ordeal that had aged them beyond their years. "This was taken just days before Elena disappeared," Agnes said. "Great-grandmother tried to help her leave town, But Elena couldn't get more than a few miles before she would collapse or become disoriented. It was like something was pulling her back. The folded paper contained a letter written in shaky handwriting, dated May 16th, 1912, just 2 days before Elena's disappearance. "My dear Agnes," Mara read aloud, "if something happens to me, you must tell someone what we saw in the canyon. Elena and I went to the old burial ground where the church used to be. We found the entrance to an underground chamber, and inside." The letter broke off abruptly, the rest of the page torn away. "What did they find?" Levi asked, and as his eyes filled with tears. "Great-grandmother never told me. She died when I was 12, and she took that secret with her. But she made me promise that if it ever happened again, if another woman came to town with the mark, I would tell them about the chamber." The next morning, Levi and Jake met at dawn to search the area where the original church had stood. Armed, with metal detectors borrowed from a friend in Cheyenne and copies of the 1879 Territorial Survey map, they spent hours methodically covering the ground until one of the detectors registered a strong signal near, a cluster of wild roses that grew more abundantly than anywhere else on the ranch. Digging carefully with hand tools, they uncovered a section of worked stone about 3 feet below the surface. The stones formed what appeared to be the top of an arch, suggesting an entrance to an underground structure. But as they cleared more dirt away, both men became increasingly uncomfortable. The temperature around the excavation site dropped noticeably, and they both reported hearing what sounded like whispered conversations in a language neither of them recognized. "We need to get Father Miguel out here," Jake said, stepping back from the partially uncovered entrance. "This feels like something we shouldn't be doing alone." That afternoon, Father Miguel arrived with a collection of blessed items and a grim expression that suggested he knew what they were likely to find. As they cleared more of the entrance, the whispers became louder and more distinct, and all 3 men reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision, shadowy figures that disappeared when they turned to look directly. The entrance led to a stone stairway that descended into darkness. Father Miguel insisted on going first, carrying a flashlight in one hand and a crucifix in the other. The air in the underground chamber was thick and strangely warm, with a sweetish smell that none of them could identify, but that made their stomachs turn. The chamber itself was larger than they had expected, roughly circular and carved from the living rock. The walls were covered with petroglyphs that seemed to shift and move in the flashlight beams, and the floor was littered with objects that gleamed dully in the artificial light. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, then immediately apologized to Father Miguel for the language. The objects scattered across the floor were human bones, but they had been arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested ritual significance. At the center of the chamber sat a large bowl carved from what looked like meteoric stone, its surface polished smooth and decorated with the same symbols they had seen on Mara's pendant. "This is it," Father Miguel said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "This is where they buried Joseph standing bare." But the burial chamber was empty. The bones they saw belonged to others' victims, perhaps, or offerings. Of the medicine man himself, there was no trace dot. As they explored the chamber more thoroughly, Levi discovered something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the wall, near what would have been the entrance, was a family tree of sorts, showing names and dates that traced the genealogy of several local families. His own family name was there, along with the Morrisons, the Crenshaws, and several others. But there was something wrong with the dates. According to the carving, the Thornton family line should have ended in 1920 with the death of Robert Thornton, Levi's supposed grandfather. Below that entry, in what appeared to be more recent carving, was Levi's own name with a question mark. Beside it, "Jake," Levi called, his voice strained. "Look at this!" Jake studied the wall carving with growing confusion. "This doesn't make sense. According to this, your grandfather died without children. But your father was Robert's son. Father Miguel joined them at the wall, running his fingers over the carved names. Unless he wasn't, he said quietly. Unless the Thornton line really did end in 1920 and someone else took the name. The implications were staggering. If the carving was accurate, then Levi wasn't really a Thornton at all. His entire family history, his connection to the ranch, his very identity, all of it might be a carefully constructed lie. As they prepared to leave the chamber, taking photographs and notes to study later, none of them noticed a small pile of bones in the darkest corner beginning to reassemble themselves. The whispers that had followed them throughout their exploration were no longer warnings. They had become something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like laughter. That night, Mara's episodes became violent for the first time. Levi woke to the sound of breaking glass and found her standing in the bathroom, her fist bloody from punching the mirror. But it wasn't Mara looking back at him from her face. Eyes had taken on a cold, calculating expression that belonged to someone else entirely. "You found my sacred chamber," she said, but the voice that came from her throat was deeper than her own, with an accent that sounded like a mixture of Spanish and something much older. "You disturbed my rest." Levi approached her slowly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "Mara, honey, it's me." "Can you hear me?" The thing wearing his wife's face smiled, and the expression was so alien on her features that it made Levi's skin crawl. "She can hear you," it said. "She screams your name, but I am stronger now. Soon she will be quiet forever." The possession lasted nearly an hour. When Mara finally returned to herself, she collapsed on the bathroom floor, her hand bleeding and her face streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding. She had no memory of the episode, but the broken mirror and Levi's terrified expression told her everything she needed to know. "It's getting stronger," she whispered, allowing Levi to help her to her feet and bandage her hand. "I can feel it. In my head, learning, growing. Sometimes I hear my own voice saying things I never said." The next morning brought Jake to their door with a face as gray as winter clouds. He carried his grandmother's journal and a manila folder that looked like it contained official documents. "I spent all night going through grandmother's papers," he said without preamble. "You need to see this." The documents in the folder were adoption papers dated 1925, showing that a 5-year-old boy named William Crowfeather had been legally adopted by Robert Thornton's widow, Margaret, after Robert's death. The boy's name had been changed to Levi Robert Thornton, and all records of his Apache heritage had been sealed. "That boy was my great-uncle," Jake said quietly. "William Crowfeather was Thomas Crowfeather's grandson. According to these papers, he was the last male descendant of Joseph Standing Bear's bloodline." Levi stared at the adoption papers with a mixture of shock and growing horror. "Are you saying I'm not really a Thornton?" "I'm saying you're exactly who you were supposed to be," Jake replied grimly. "Look at the dates." Robert Thornton died in 1920, right around the time the last marked woman disappeared. 5 years later, his widow adopts a Native American boy and gives him the Thornton name. Then, roughly 30 years after that, another outsider woman arrives and marries into the family. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more horrifying than anything they had imagined. The town hadn't been protecting itself from some random supernatural occurrence. They had been facilitating it, generation after generation, ensuring that the right bloodlines were in place when the entity needed them. "My grandmother's notes mentioned something called the calling," Jake continued, opening the journal to a page marked with a piece of ribbon. "Every 30 to 40 years, the spirit becomes strong enough to reach out and call a suitable host to the town. But it can only possess women who are connected to specific bloodlines through marriage." "Connected how?" Mara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The women have to be married to descendants of the families who were present when Joseph Standing Bear was first buried. Jake explained. The spiritual bonds that tie the families to this land also make their wives vulnerable to possession. But there's more. The spirit specifically targets women who are grieving, displaced, or emotionally vulnerable. That's what makes them easier to influence. Mara thought about her own circumstances when she had arrived in Cedar Ridge grieving her parents, lost and searching for meaning, desperate for a connection to something stable and real. She had been the perfect target. But why me specifically? She asked. There must be other vulnerable women who could have been drawn here. Jake turned to another page in his grandmother's journal. Because you're not just any vulnerable woman. According to the genealogical research grandmother did, your maiden name Wells appears in the territorial records. Your great-great-grandmother was Catherine Wells, who came to Wyoming in 1873 as a schoolteacher. She married Samuel Morrison, my great-great-grandfather, but died in childbirth the following year. The revelation hit Mara like a physical blow. We're related? Distant cousins, Jake confirmed. Which means you carry the bloodline from both sides Morrison and, through your marriage to Levi, the spiritual connection to Joseph Standing Bear's family line. You're not just a host, Mara. You're the perfect host. That afternoon, while researching in the county courthouse basement, they discovered additional evidence that the town's conspiracy ran deeper than they had imagined. Among the old surveyor's maps and territorial documents, they found the original 1879 survey that showed the exact locations of the Native American burial sites. The map revealed that the Thornton ranch house hadn't been built on the burial ground by accident and had been positioned deliberately to sit directly over the most sacred ceremonial site, the place where Joseph Standing Bear's burial chamber was located. Every building in the town center had been similarly positioned to form a geometric pattern that corresponded to the traditional Apache spiritual practices for containing malevolent spirits. The whole town is a containment system, Levi said, studying the map with growing understanding. They built it specifically to keep the spirit trapped while still allowing it enough freedom to feed occasionally. But the containment was failing. As they researched further, they discovered that each generation's sacrifice had made the spirit stronger rather than satisfying it. The 30 to 40-year cycle was accelerating, and the possessions were becoming more complete and longer-lasting. Father Miguel arrived as they were finishing their research, carrying additional documents from the diocesan archives. His face was grave as he spread the papers across the table. I've been in contact with the archdiocese, he said. They have records of similar cases in other locations where Catholic churches were built over Native American burial grounds. In every case, the attempts to contain the spirits through architecture and ritual eventually failed. Failed how? Mara asked, though she dreaded the answer. The spirits broke free and possessed entire communities, Father Miguel replied. In some cases, hundreds of people died before the church was able to intervene with more drastic measures. He showed them photographs of what had been the town of Santos Milagros in New Mexico, where a similar situation had occurred in 1934. The town had been completely evacuated and eventually burned to the ground after the spirit had possessed nearly the entire population. The difference here, Father Miguel continued, is that the spirit in Cedar Ridge has been more patient, more intelligent. Instead of trying to break free all at once, it's been learning, growing stronger with each generation of hosts. But according to these records, that patience may be coming to an end. As if summoned by their conversation, Mara suddenly stiffened in her chair. When she looked up, her eyes had changed again. They were older now, filled with knowledge and malice that belonged to someone who had been dead for over a century. You speak of me as if I cannot hear, she said in that same alien voice they had heard before. But I am always listening, and now I am strong enough to hear everything. The possessed Mara stood slowly, her movements deliberate and predatory. The black markings on her face seemed to pulse with their own dark light. and when she smiled, it was with the confidence of someone who held all the cards in a game the others didn't even know they were playing. "Did you really think I didn't know about your little investigation?" the spirit asked through Mara's voice. "I have been watching, listening, learning for more than a century. Every secret you think you've discovered, every piece of evidence you believe makes you clever, I allowed you to find it all." Levi rose from his chair, his hands clenched into fists. "Let her go. Take me instead." The thing wearing his wife's face laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. "You still don't understand, do you? None of you understand what this has really been about." Father Miguel began reciting Latin prayers under his breath, but the spirit seemed unaffected. If anything, it appeared amused by his efforts. "Your prayers have no power here, priest," it said. "This ground was sacred long before your false god claimed it. But please, continue. Your God and I have more in common than you might think." The spirit began to pace around the room, examining the documents they had spread across the table. "You found the adoption papers," it observed. "Good. I was wondering how long it would take you to discover that particular truth." "What truth?" Levi demanded. The spirit gestured to the papers with Mara's hand. "The truth that you are not a victim of circumstance, Levi Thornton, or should I say, William Crowfeather? You are the culmination of a plan that has been 90 years in the making." Jake stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "You're lying." "Am I?" The spirit turned Mara's eyes toward him, and Jake involuntarily stepped back. "Tell me, Jacob Morrison, what did your family tell you about your role in all this? Did they claim they were just innocent bystanders, trying to help contain an ancient evil?" When Jake didn't answer, the spirit smiled again. Of course they did. Just as the Crenshaws told their children, they were trying to protect the town. Just as Doc Henley believes he's been providing medical care rather than facilitating possessions. The spirit moved to the window and looked out at the town beyond. Every family in Cedar Ridge has played their part, generation after generation. The Morrisons provided the genealogical knowledge to identify suitable hosts. The Crenshaws managed the social integration, making sure the chosen women felt welcome until it was too late. The Henleys provided the medical intervention that weakened the host's resistance to possession. "That's impossible," Levi said. "These people aren't evil. They're good, honest. They're frightened," the spirit interrupted. "And fear makes people capable of remarkable self-deception. Do you think Martha Crenshaw doesn't know what happened to Elena Vasquez? Do you think Doc Henley doesn't understand what those antibiotics really do to the women he prescribes them to?" The room fell silent except for the spirit's footsteps as it continued pacing in Mara's body. "But the most beautiful part of the plan," it continued, "was creating the perfect bloodline vessel. You see, when I was first buried, the bindings were strong. I needed a way to weaken them gradually, generation by generation. The solution was elegant in its simplicity." The spirit turned to face Levi directly. "Your adoption wasn't an act of kindness by a grieving widow. Margaret Thornton was instructed to take you, to raise you as her own, and to ensure that when you came of age, you would be guided to take over the ranch that sits directly above my burial chamber." "Instructed by who?" Father Miguel asked. "By of course," the spirit replied. "Through the woman the first possessed in 1920 Margaret's sister, Elizabeth. She lived long enough to arrange your adoption and establish the framework for everything that followed. The horror of it was beginning to sink in. Levi's entire life, his identity, his marriage, his home had been orchestrated by the entity that was now possessing his wife. "You manipulated everything," Levi said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I prefer to think of it as investment in the future," the spirit replied. "Each possession taught me more about the modern world, helped me understand how to navigate the changes that occurred while I was bound. By the time Mara arrived, beautiful, grieving, desperate Mara, I was ready. The spirit moved to where the obsidian pendant lay on the table and picked it up with Mara's fingers. This pendant wasn't just a ceremonial object buried with my physical form. It was a key, designed to unlock the bindings that held me to the burial chamber. But it could only be activated by someone who carried both bloodlines standing bare. Through the male line, and one of the original families through the female line. The mixed bloodlines created a spiritual bridge, Father Miguel said, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. That's why you needed Mara specifically. Brilliant, isn't it? The spirit said, Mara's marriage to Levi didn't just make her vulnerable to possession. It made her the perfect conduit for my escape. Every day she spends on this land, every night she sleeps above my burial chamber, weakens the bindings a little more. Jake was studying the genealogical charts spread across the table. But if that's true, then why are you still bound? Why do you still need to possess her? The spirit's expression grew cold. Because the original bindings were more complex than I initially understood. Breaking free requires not just the right bloodlines, but a willing sacrifice from someone who loves the vessel more than their own life. All eyes turned to Levi, and the spirit smiled with Mara's face. Did you think your feelings for her were entirely your own? It asked. I guided every aspect of your courtship, made sure you would fall completely, hopelessly in love with her. Because when the time comes, and it will come very soon, you will choose to save her, even if it means damning yourself. I won't do it, Levi said firmly. Whatever you need from me, you won't get it. Oh, but you will, the spirit replied with absolute certainty. Because the alternative is watching me consume her soul completely, leaving nothing but an empty shell that looks like the woman you love. And then, when I'm free, I'll move on to possess every woman in this town, starting with the children. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Father Miguel gripped his crucifix tighter, but his prayers seemed hollow against the ancient malevolence that spoke through Mara's voice. You see, the spirit continued, I learned something important. During my century of imprisonment, individual possession is limited, temporary. But if I can break free from the burial chamber entirely, I can possess multiple hosts simultaneously. Imagine an entire town of people under my control, spreading out to infect other communities, other states. I could build an empire of the possessed, all serving my will. The scope of the threat was staggering. This wasn't just about saving Mara or even protecting Cedar Ridge. It was about preventing a supernatural plague that could spread across the entire country. But first, the spirit said, Mara's eyes focusing on Levi with terrifying intensity, I need you to make a choice. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the veil between worlds is thinnest, you will come to my burial chamber. You will bring the sacred firebowl that your friends so helpfully uncovered, and you will perform the ritual that will set me free. And if I refuse? Levi asked, though he already knew the answer. The spirit gestured toward Mara's transformed face, where the black markings had now spread to cover her entire left side. Then you will watch her die slowly, one piece at a time, until there is nothing left of the woman you married. And then I will take the children anyway. With that pronouncement, Mara collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing as the spirit released its hold on her consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes, they were her own again, filled with terror and confusion. Levi? She whispered. What happened? I can't remember anything after we sat down to look at the maps. But Levi was staring at the table where the spirit had been examining their research. All of their carefully gathered evidence, the adoption papers, the genealogical charts, the territorial surveys had been reduced to ash, leaving only the faint smell of sulfur in the air. The destruction of their research was only the beginning. Over the next 24 hours, as the dark moon approached, the supernatural activity in Cedar Ridge escalated beyond anything the town had ever experienced. Animals fled the area, and droves of cattle broke through fences to escape. Dogs howled continuously until their owners brought them inside, and even the birds seemed to avoid flying over the town. Mara's condition deteriorated rapidly. The black markings now covered the entire left side of her face and had begun spreading down her neck toward her chest. During her increasingly frequent episodes of possession, the spirit spoke through her in languages that predated written history, and her physical strength became superhuman. Levi had to restrain her with rope during the worst episodes to prevent her from hurting herself or others. But it was the moments of clarity that were the most heartbreaking. When Mara returned to herself, she was fully aware of what was happening and what the spirit intended. She begged Levi to find a way to stop the entity, even if it meant sacrificing her life. "Don't let it use me to hurt other people," she pleaded during one of her lucid periods. "Promise me that if there's no other way, you'll do what you have to do." Levi couldn't bring himself to make that promise. Instead, he spent every moment of her possession episodes researching alternatives, desperately searching for some way to save both Mara and prevent the spirit's escape. Jake arrived at dawn on the day of the dark moon, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of metal objects. His face was haggard from lack of sleep, but his expression was determined. "I found something," he said, emptying the bag onto the kitchen table. "Grandmother's ceremonial items. She kept them hidden all these years, waiting for someone who might need them." The objects were clearly Native American in origin: a sage bundle for cleansing, a carved bone knife, several small pouches containing what appeared to be herbs and ground minerals, and a necklace made from turquoise and silver that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Grandmother left instructions," Jake continued, unfolding a piece of paper covered in her careful handwriting. "She wrote them in Apache first, then translated them into English. It's a binding ritual, but not the kind the spirit expects." Father Miguel studied the instructions with growing interest. "This isn't about trapping the spirit in the burial chamber," he said. "It's about binding it to a willing host permanently, preventing it from ever escaping or possessing anyone else." "The host wouldn't survive," Levi said immediately. "That's not a solution. That's just trading Mara's life for everyone else's." "Not necessarily," Jake replied. "According to grandmother's notes, the binding can be performed on someone who shares the spirit's bloodline, someone who has the spiritual strength to contain it without being consumed." The implication was clear. Levi, as William Crowfeather, and a descendant of Joseph Standing Bear's family line, had the potential to become a permanent prison for the spirit, but only if he entered into the binding willingly and with full knowledge of what it would cost him. "The ritual requires 3 elements," Jake continued, reading from his grandmother's notes. "The sacred fire bowl, which we already found, a willing host from the bloodline, and ... He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "And the sacrifice of something the spirit values above its own freedom." What could a spirit like that possibly value? Father Miguel asked. Jake's eyes moved to Mara, who was currently unconscious on the living room couch, her breathing shallow. "And labored, the perfect host." According to grandmother's notes, if the spirit has invested years in preparing a specific vessel, it becomes spiritually attached to that person. Destroying the host would cause the spirit genuine pain, enough to weaken it during the binding process. The room fell silent as the full horror of what Jake was suggesting sank in. To bind the spirit permanently, they would need to kill Mara, while simultaneously trapping the entity within Levi's body. It was a solution that saved everyone except the 2 people who meant the most to each other. "There has to be another way," Levi said desperately. "Something we haven't thought of." Father Miguel had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing theological complexities. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it would require something the church has forbidden for centuries." He explained that among the documents he had retrieved from the diocesan archives was a record of an exorcism performed in 1634 by a Jesuit missionary in what is now Arizona. The case involved a Spanish conquistador who had been possessed by the spirit of an Apache war chief, creating a similar situation where the possessed individual retained some degree of consciousness and control. The exorcism wasn't successful in the traditional sense, Father Miguel said. The priest couldn't expel the spirit completely, but he was able to reverse the possession to trap the conquistador's soul inside the war chief's spiritual form and bind them both to a sacred object. What kind of sacred object? Levi asked. Father Miguel gestured toward the fire bowl that sat in the center of the table. Something like that. An object that had been touched by both spirits and blessed by appropriate religious authority. The bound spirits became guardians rather than prisoners, conscious and aware, but dedicated to protecting the location from other supernatural threats. The solution was still a form of sacrifice, but it offered something the other options didn't: the possibility that Mara and the spirit could coexist in a way that preserved her essential self while containing the entity's malevolent power. How would we even attempt something like that? Jake asked. Father Miguel pulled out another set of documents, these ones handwritten in Latin with extensive margin notes in English. The Jesuit priest documented the entire process. It requires a combination of Christian blessing and Native American spirit binding, performed simultaneously by practitioners of both traditions. As they studied the ritual instructions, Mara began to stir on the couch. When she opened her eyes, however, it wasn't the spirit looking back at them. It was Mara herself, but changed. Her voice, when she spoke, carried an otherworldly quality that suggested she was somehow aware of both her own thoughts and the entity's. "I can hear everything you're discussing," she said, sitting up slowly. "Both of us can. The spirit is curious about this ritual you found." "Curious how?" Levi asked, moving to sit beside her on the couch. Mara's expression was strange, part fear, part fascination. It's never encountered a binding like this before. The other rituals it's experienced were about containment or banishment. This one is about ... partnership. Through Mara, the spirit began asking questions about the ritual technical details, about the spiritual mechanics involved, the long-term implications for both entities, and the level of consciousness each would retain. The questions were sophisticated, suggesting that the entity was seriously considering the proposition, rather than simply looking for ways to sabotage it. "Why would it be interested in cooperation?" Father Miguel asked. "Everything we know about this spirit suggests it's purely malevolent." Mara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes unfocused as if she was listening to an internal conversation. When she spoke again, her voice carried both her own pain and something that might have been the spirit's ancient loneliness. "Joseph Standing Bear has been conscious and alone for over a century," she said. "Trapped in a burial chamber with nothing but his own thoughts and the occasional possession to remind him of what life was like. He single quotes tired. The idea of sharing consciousness with someone else, of having a genuine companion rather than just a host to consume, appeals to him." It was the first time anyone had referred to the spirit by its original human name, and the effect was startling. Suddenly, the entity possessing Mara wasn't just an ancient evil. It was the remnant of a person who had been buried alive and left to endure more than a century of solitary imprisonment. "But there would be conditions," Mara continued, her voice taking on the formal tone the spirit used during its direct communications. "The binding must allow both consciousness equal access to the shared body, and there must be a way to end the partnership if it becomes unbearable for either party." Father Miguel considered this carefully. "The Jesuits' notes mention a release clause," he said. "If both spirits agreed, they could choose to move on to whatever comes after death. But it would have to be a unanimous decision." As the day progressed, toward evening, they refined the details of the ritual. Jake would provide the Native American spiritual components, drawing on his grandmother's teachings and the ceremonial items she had preserved. Father Miguel would handle the Christian elements, adapting the Jesuits' Latin prayers for their specific situation. And Levi would serve as the anchor point, someone with deep emotional connections to both Mara and the land itself who could help stabilize the binding process. The sacred fire bowl would serve as the focal point, containing the spiritual energy of the binding and providing a physical anchor for the merged consciousness. But first, it needed to be properly prepared through a complex process of cleansing and blessing that would take several hours as sunset approached. They moved their preparations to the burial chamber beneath the ranch house. The underground space felt different than it had during their previous visit, less threatening, more expectant, as if the ancient stones themselves were aware that something momentous was about to occur. Mara descended the stone steps with a serenity that was both her own and not her own. The black markings on her face had stopped spreading, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed to be in complete control of her actions. "Are you ready for this?" Levi asked, taking her hand as they reached the chamber floor. She squeezed his fingers gently. "Both of us are," she replied, and for once, the dual nature of that statement felt like hope rather than horror. The ritual began at the stroke of midnight, when the dark moon hung invisible in the star-filled sky above Cedar Ridge. In the burial chamber, Jake had arranged the ceremonial items according to his grandmother's precise instructions: sage bundles burning at the 4 cardinal points, the turquoise and silver necklace placed around the sacred fire bowl, and the bone knife positioned to reflect the firelight into specific patterns on the chamber walls. Father Miguel stood opposite Jake, his Latin prayers creating a counterpoint to the Apache chants that Jake recited from memory. The two spiritual traditions, which had clashed so violently during the historical period when Joseph Standing Bear was first buried, now worked together toward a common goal of redemption rather than destruction. Levi knelt beside the fire bowl, his hands resting on its meteoric stone surface as he focused his thoughts on the love he felt for Mara and the connection he had discovered to his own native heritage. In his pocket was the medicine pouch that had belonged to his biological grandfather, a tangible link to the Apache bloodline that made him uniquely suited to anchor the binding ritual. But it was Mara who stood at the center of it all, her face illuminated by the dancing flames that rose from the sacred bowl. The black markings that had spread across her features no longer looked like symptoms of an infection. They appeared as ceremonial paint, marking her as a spiritual vessel worthy of respect rather than fear. "Joseph Standing Bear," Father Miguel called out in a voice that carried both authority and compassion, "we call upon you to participate willingly in this binding, not as prisoner, but as partner." The response came through Mara's voice, but it carried the weight and dignity of someone who had once been a powerful leader among his people. "I am here, priest of the foreign god. I am ready to accept this new form of existence if it means an end to the loneliness and a chance for redemption." Jake's chanting intensified, his voice weaving through the ancient Apache words that his grandmother had taught him as protection against malevolent spirits. But these weren't words of banishment. They were invitations for healing, calls for balance between opposing forces, and requests for the spiritual strength needed to maintain a delicate equilibrium. The fire in the bowl began to change color, shifting from orange and yellow to a brilliant blue-white that seemed to draw light from the air itself. The flames reached higher, casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls that moved in patterns too complex and meaningful to be mere chants. "Mara Elizabeth Wells Thornton," Father Miguel continued, "do you willingly accept this binding, knowing that it will forever change the nature of your existence?" Mara's response came in her own voice, clear and determined despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. "I accept," knowing that this choice allows me to protect the people I love while offering companionship to someone who has suffered alone for far too long. The moment of actual binding began with a sensation that Levi later described as feeling like the air itself was being rewoven around them. The blue-white flames suddenly expanded beyond the bowl, creating a column of spiritual fire that enveloped Mara completely. Through the flames, he could see her face changing, not being consumed or transformed, but somehow becoming more than it had been before. The black markings that had spread across her features began to shift and reorganize themselves, forming patterns that looked like traditional Apache face paint combined with something entirely new. Her eyes, when the flames allowed glimpses of them, showed a depth of awareness that suggested two distinct consciousnesses, learning to coexist within the same mind. Jake's chanting reached a crescendo, his voice joined by what sounded like other voices, whispers from the past that spoke in languages that had been silent for generations. The ancestral spirits were blessing this union, giving their approval to a solution that honored both the justice demanded by Joseph Standing Bear's suffering and the mercy required by Mara's innocence. Father Miguel's Latin prayers shifted from exorcism to blessing, calling upon divine grace to sanctify this unprecedented joining of souls. The Christian God and the Apache spirits were working together, their combined power creating something neither tradition could have achieved alone. But the most crucial element was Levi's role as spiritual anchor. Through his connection to both bloodlines, Apache through his birth, Thornton through his adoption, he provided the stability needed to prevent the binding from collapsing under the weight of its own spiritual complexity. His love for Mara and his newly discovered respect for his native heritage created a bridge between past and present, between justice and mercy. The fire began to subside, the blue-white flames gradually returning to more natural colors. As the spiritual energy settled into its new configuration, Mara's body swayed but remained upright, supported by forces that went beyond the merely physical. When she opened her eyes, they held a wisdom that was both ancient and eternally young. A combination of Joseph Standing Bear's centuries of experience and Mara's contemporary understanding of the world. The binding had worked, but the true test would come in the moments that followed. Would this merged consciousness find peace? Or would the fundamental differences between the two spirits tear the binding apart? The first moments after the binding were crucial. Mara stood perfectly still in the center of the chamber, her breathing deep and measured as two distinct consciousnesses learned to share the same physical form. The black markings on her face had stabilized into intricate patterns that seemed to shift subtly in the firelight, suggesting an ongoing dialogue between the merged spirits. "How do you feel?" Levi asked gently, not sure which consciousness would respond. When she opened her eyes, they reflected a complexity that was both familiar and utterly new. "We feel ... She began, then paused, as if consulting with her internal companion. "Peaceful. For the first time in over a century, Joseph feels truly at rest. And for the first time since my parents died, I feel complete." Her voice carried traces of both personalities, Mara's warmth and compassion, combined with Joseph Standing Bear's dignity and hard-earned wisdom. The result was something entirely unique, a consciousness that was greater than the sum of its parts. Father Miguel approached, carefully, watching for any signs that the binding might be unstable. "Are you able to maintain separate thoughts, or have your consciousnesses merged completely?" "We are distinct but connected," she replied, and now it was clearly Joseph speaking through Mara's voice. "Like two streams that have joined to form a single river. We share awareness and memory, but we remain ourselves." The sacred fire bowl, which had been the focal point of the binding ritual, was now cool to the touch, but had undergone a fundamental transformation. The meteoric stone had taken on a lustrous quality that seemed to pulse with gentle light, and the symbols carved into its surface had been joined, by new markings that appeared to represent the successful completion of the binding. Jake was studying these new symbols with fascination. "My grandmother told me stories about spirit vessels," he said. "Objects that contained the essence of powerful shamans who had chosen to remain connected to the physical world rather than moving on to the your next life. But I never thought I'd see one created." "This vessel," Mara said, her voice now carrying both personalities simultaneously, "will serve as an anchor point. If the binding ever becomes too difficult to maintain, we can choose to enter it completely, existing as guardian spirits for this place, rather than separate souls seeking individual destinations." The implications were profound. The sacred fireball had become more than just a ritual object. It was a backup plan, a way for the merged consciousness to continue protecting the area even if sharing a physical form proved impossible over the long term. But as they prepared to leave the chamber, they discovered that the binding had effects beyond what anyone had anticipated. The underground space, which had felt oppressive and threatening during their previous visits, now radiated a sense of peace and protection. The ancient petroglyphs on the walls seemed to glow with approval, and the air itself felt cleaner, as if some fundamental contamination had been purified. More dramatically, the binding appeared to have resolved the supernatural problems that had plagued Cedar Ridge for over a century. The spiritual energy that had been trapped and festering in the burial chamber was now contained within a willing vessel and directed toward protection rather than malevolence. As they emerged from the chamber, they found that the night sky had begun to change. Aurora-like lights danced across the Wyoming heavens, not the usual northern lights that occasionally appeared in the region, but something more localized and intentional. The lights formed patterns that resembled both Apache spiritual symbols and Christian iconography, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the successful resolution of an ancient conflict. "The ancestors approve," Mara said, her voice carrying Joseph's reverence for spiritual signs. "Both Apache and Christian spirits are blessing this union." Father Miguel nodded, his own understanding of divine will confirming what they could all see in the sky above them. This is exactly what the Jesuit priest described in his records. When the binding was successful, the heavens showed their approval through signs that honored both spiritual traditions. The walk back to the ranch house felt like a journey through transformed territory. The land itself seemed different, more alive, more welcoming, as if it had been waiting for over a century for this particular resolution. Wildlife that had fled the area during the preceding days was already returning, and even the cattle in the distant pastures seemed calmer and more settled. But the most significant change was in Mara herself, or rather, in the being she had become. The constant tension and fear that had marked her features during the possession was gone, replaced by a serenity that came from knowing her purpose and having the spiritual strength to fulfill it. "Will you stay here?" Levi asked as they reached the porch, unsure how to navigate a relationship with someone who was both his wife and something far more complex. "We will stay," she replied, and her smile contained both Mara's love for him and Joseph's gratitude for being offered a chance at redemption. "This land needs guardians, and we have found peace in being what it needs us to be." The sacred fire bowl, now carried carefully in Levi's hands, pulsed with gentle warmth, a reminder that their solution, however unconventional, had the approval of powers far greater than any of them could fully comprehend. 3 months after the binding ritual, Cedar Ridge had transformed into something it had never been in its entire history, a genuinely peaceful community. The supernatural tension that had lurked beneath the surface of daily life for over a century was gone, replaced by an atmosphere of healing and renewal that seemed to touch every aspect of the town's existence. Mara moved through her daily routines with the grace of someone who had found perfect balance within herself. The merged consciousness she shared with Joseph standing bare had settled into a harmony that allowed both personalities to contribute their strengths while respecting each other's individuality. She still looked like herself, but there was a depth to her presence that spoke of ancient wisdom combined with contemporary compassion. The physical changes had stabilized as well. The black markings on her face had evolved into intricate patterns that resembled traditional Apache face paint, but only when examined closely. From a distance, they appeared to be natural variations in her skin tone, making her striking rather than frightening. She had learned to control their visibility, allowing them to fade during public appearances and emerge more prominently during private moments when she was communing with the spiritual aspects of her new nature. Levi had adapted to loving a wife who was also something far more complex than he had ever imagined possible. The woman he held each night was still Mara in all the ways that mattered: her laugh, her kindness, her way of making coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But she also carried the wisdom and dignity of a powerful shaman who had learned the Zund value of patience through more than a century of suffering. "Do you miss being just yourself?" he asked her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. She considered the question carefully, as she did all inquiries about her transformed state. "I miss the simplicity," she replied in her own voice, "but I wouldn't trade the completeness I feel now for anything. Joseph and I have become something neither of us could have been alone." The ranch itself had become a place of pilgrimage for people dealing with spiritual difficulties. Word had spread, carefully and quietly, through networks of clergy and Native American spiritual leaders about the successful resolution of Cedar Ridge's supernatural problems. Visitors came seeking guidance, healing, or simply the peace that seemed to radiate from the land itself. Father Miguel had worked with tribal elders from several reservations to establish the ranch as an official interfaith sanctuary, a place where Christian and Native American spiritual traditions could work together rather than competing for dominance. The burial chamber had been transformed into a meditation space, blessed by both Catholic priests and Apache medicine men, where people could come to pray, reflect, or seek spiritual guidance. The sacred fire bowl held a place of honor in this underground sanctuary, serving as a focal point for prayers and a tangible reminder that redemption was possible, even in the most dire circumstances. Visitors often reported feeling a sense of profound peace when they spent time in the presence of the bowl, as if the merged spirits contained within the binding were actively blessing those who sought healing. Jake Morrison had taken on the role of official historian for the sanctuary, documenting the true story of what had happened in Cedar Ridge and ensuring that future generations would understand both the mistakes that had been made and the solution that had ultimately been found. His grandmother's journals and ceremonial items were displayed in a small museum that he established in the town center, creating an educational resource for visitors who wanted to understand the Native American spiritual traditions that were so crucial to the area's healing. The townspeople had undergone their own process of reckoning and redemption. The revelation of their families' roles in perpetuating the cycle of supernatural possession had forced a community-wide examination of conscience that was both painful and ultimately liberating. Martha Crenshaw had become one of the most vocal advocates for transparency and reconciliation, using her store as a gathering place where people could share their family stories and work through the guilt and fear that had shaped their community. For generations, Doc Henley, who had struggled most with learning about his unwitting role in weakening the possessed women's resistance, had dedicated himself to studying the intersection of medicine and spirituality. He worked closely with Mara and Joseph to understand how the possession had affected her physically and what could be learned to help others who might face similar spiritual challenges. The economic impact of the sanctuary had breathed new life into Cedar Ridge. The Copper Kettle Cafe expanded to accommodate spiritual retreat groups. Local artisans began creating crafts that honored both Apache and Christian traditions, And the town's population actually began to grow for the first time in decades as people moved to the area, specifically to be part of a community that had found a way to heal ancient wounds. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the relationship between the living and the dead. The spirits of Elena Vasquez and the other women who had been consumed by Joseph Standing Bear's desperate hunger. The life had found peace through the binding ritual. Visitors to the sanctuary often reported sensing their presence, not as haunting or frightening apparitions, but as gentle guardians who blessed those seeking healing and redemption. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the sanctuary visitors had returned to their own homes, Levi and Mara would walk through the memorial garden they had planted above the old burial chamber. Wildflowers bloomed there in patterns that seemed too perfect to be natural, and the air always carried the faint scent of sage and sweetgrass, as if the earth itself was offering prayers of gratitude. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Levi would sometimes ask, still amazed by the magnitude of what they had undertaken. And Mara would smile with the combined wisdom of two souls, who had found peace in the most unlikely of partnerships. "We made the only choice that honored everyone's need for healing," she would reply. And look what grew from it. Above them, the Wyoming sky stretched endlessly toward the horizon, filled with more stars than seemed possible and touched occasionally by those aurora-like lights that had become a regular blessing over their transformed land. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled peacefully, marking a community that had finally learned to live in harmony with its past rather than being haunted by it. The sacred fire bowl pulsed gently in its place of honor, an eternal reminder that love, courage, and the willingness to sacrifice for others could transform even the darkest spiritual circumstances into something beautiful and life-giving.